the more I write, the less I like just pure description. I think it's got to serve that purpose of, or multiple purposes of also developing the character or giving us some idea about what this situation is bringing to him. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a brief recap of what I've done before. I did that last week as well. And then I'm going to dive into the actual subject matter of this particular workshop, which is, it's more about the ascent up the mountain. For those who've just started today, I'll explain that a bit more. And it's really about how to use research and world building, that famous term, to help you power up the mountain. So going back to the brief recap, on session one, I explained the mountain, why I call it the mountain, the novel as a series of ascents. I talked particularly about how I always believe that a lot of people don't write because they don't fully grasp the process, or they start writing and then quite quickly fall away because they don't think their stuff is good enough, or they judge themselves, they compare themselves perhaps to some of their favorite authors, and they think, my stuff isn't instantly as good as their stuff, so therefore I can't write. It's something that I went through a lot myself. I think probably most writers do. That they think because their initial forays aren't like their heroes' work, that they must lack the writing gene. They're born without it, perhaps. Well, let me tell you, the writing gene doesn't exist. And though I'm a great respecter of people's innate abilities, even Mozart had to practice the scales, right? So it's a question for me of separating out the different stages of the process, which is why I call it the mountain, the novel as a series of ascents. And in that first workshop, I talked about how the first ascent, the first climb, I call it the free climb, because when I'm setting out, I don't necessarily know that much. I'm going to get into a little bit more during today's session about some of the stuff I will know in order to start me getting up the mountain. But I have these rules around the first draft. One is you remove the words good and bad from your vocabulary. It's nothing about that. Any of the writing is not about that. Because that will be a later stage of the process. And in fact, I still don't think they're particularly useful words. I think the important thing about any piece of writing is whether it works or doesn't. Does it convey the author's meaning and what they're trying to get out of that particular piece of writing? Secondly, I say don't look down, which basically means keep going. A lot of writers, and there are writers, and I always need to add this sort of not warning, but just that there are so many ways to write. There are probably as many ways of writing as there are writers. What I try to do is give you options to perhaps do things that you hadn't done before. I'm not saying that this is, I didn't go up the mountain and get the 10 tablets. Right. Though I do believe I know the secret of writing, which I did share last week, which is that for those who weren't here, writing is writing. That's my, it's over there. It's over there on my board. Writing is writing in my terrible writing. So I'm a great believer in just keep pushing through. So don't look down means don't be rereading a lot of your stuff. The first draft stuff is just going to annoy you because it's so first drafty. Keep going up. You might need to read a little bit to get yourself going again. And the third thing, the third sort of rule I have around it is don't show your first draft to anyone. That's hard to do if you're in writing groups, I know, and people are demanding that you produce for the writing group. I still would work it much more than the first draft because first drafts, if they're just for you, if you're not thinking of a readership or an audience in any way, then it allows you to be poorly spelled, badly grammatical, write questionable things that you definitely wouldn't want your mother to read and know that it's even in your brain. That sort of stuff. Stuff that's important for you to get out, perhaps, because writing is writing. And those things, when you're creating out of the ferment of your mind, those things are the very things you need to be bouncing off to power you up the mountain. The second class I did, and this is going to play in again and again and again to every class I teach, and that is about characters. I taught a character workshop. And everything I'm going to say today about research and world building is really based around the character. And I will come on to that. Just to share a couple of things that I quoted. One was from a book I highly recommend. I think I've already said I don't do a lot of writing manual reading. I've read the odd one, but I'm not a great, I must buy the latest writing manual because it'll have the secret and I will know how to write my books. I don't do that. Not that there's amazing things to learn, and I'm probably just being ignorant by not reading more of them, but I have my own way. And also, I haven't got time. I'm so busy writing my books. But one book I did read was called Into the Woods by John York. And that's York, the city with an E on the end. And he's a producer at the BBC, a script editor, a writer himself. But I think mainly he's been in development and he understands how story works. And that's really what that's about. And he says, the central character has an active goal. They desire something. If they don't, then it's almost impossible to care for them. I think that's true. So keep that in mind with your characters. And then I told a story about Noel Coward, who my father flew around the Middle East during World War II. And he said in a letter to my father, where my father had obviously violated all Noel Coward's commandments on writing, he said, let your characters dictate your plot rather than your plot dictate your characters. Words to live by. Okay, the other thing I talked about with the characters was my acronym Komoka, COMOCA, characters, objectives, meeting obstacles, creates action. And that is again going to factor into what I'm going to talk about today, because some of the obstacles that will be thrown up and therefore your character encountering them will be stuff that you've either researched or you've put into the worlds you're building. So one of the things I absolutely fervently believe in, and I discovered this early on, was that people think research is about getting the details right. And when I'm talking research here, I'm not just talking about historical or present day drama or docudrama or anything like that. I'm also talking about fantasy books. My agent, who had secured me a 3-book deal finally with Gollancz to write the fantasy trilogy, which I'm just finishing off, which is called Immortal's Blood. And I'm just literally reading the page proofs of book 3 of that, which is called The Wars of Gods and Men. He was saying to me, oh, well, won't it be great, Chris? You usually write historical fiction, which is not actually true, but I do write some. And he said, so you won't need to do any research. Oh, how I laughed, because you always need to do research, especially if you're creating a world that's based on our world, which most fantasy worlds tend to be. George R.R. Martin would have done extensive research on, he always says it's the Wars of the Roses, guys. J.R.R. Tolkien, obviously, he was a professor of Old English. So he had done a ton of research on those sort of languages and all that. But the thing they would have done, even if they don't know this expression, that the research, details are great. You want to get the details right. But what a good fact does for you, in fact, is it acts as the springboard for the imagination. That, to me, is the key. a fact is a fact and can be useful or not. But if it stimulates the imagination, if it then provides you with opportunities to create obstacles for your characters, or aid for your characters, or some different way for making your characters think about things, then it's served its purpose. I'm going to give you some illustrations from my own work to show you how I would use a fact and how it would act as the springboard for the imagination. I'm going to do some on historical fiction, and I'm going to do some on fantasy as well. I have a very recent example. I'm in that weird stage at the moment where I'm basically doing the final read through even of page proofs, which is the very last stage you get to before publication. It's usually when they've taken your manuscript, it's been copy edited, it's gone in, the publishers have set it out as it would be printed. However, I still have an opportunity to make the odd correction. And it's interesting, at this stage, it's actually limited to something like, I don't know, 5% of the text or something. If I do anything more than that, if I say, right, oh, I don't like that character anymore, I want to get rid of him. If it goes above that, I would have to actually pay for it. Isn't that absurd? It's in my contract. But usually it's about, there's little mistakes, words have been run together by the man who's put it into the print. So there's two words, characters dictate are two words, or one word rather. Or I'll spot perhaps an incongruity in the plot or something. There might be something that doesn't quite work. So there's that. I've just finished, and I won't go into it in extreme length here because I'm very excited about it, because this is the longest time I've ever spent writing a book. I actually came up with the idea for this book in 2014, started writing it then kind of my editor left the house that was going to buy it, and then I dropped it for 2 years. Anyway, 7 years later, I finally wrote the end on the first draft. And in the meantime, I've written 5 other novels. So it's called Sonata at Midnight, and it's back to historical fiction, World War II, in fact. So what I've found, and research is, I'm a closet historian, really. I was meant to go to university and read history, and I got hijacked by acting. I went to drama school instead, but I was all set to go to Cambridge and read history. It would have been wonderful. I love history. But in the end, I probably would only have done what I ended up doing, which is write historical fiction anyway. So, what I do with the research, I obviously do a ton of research, and I usually do a couple of months reading before I start a book. When I wrote my first novel, I did 6 years of it before I discovered the penalties of research, which is that research can be procrastination. It really can. You can just sort of go, I need to know everything about this subject. You don't actually need to know enough about the subject to get you going, and then you start writing, and then the characters, again, will tell you what you need to research. The story will tell you as well. The word I've been using in my previous sessions is oscillation. I love the word oscillation in writing because you oscillate back and forth between the character and the plot, between plot and research, between actual history and how it's used in your story, between plot and the world you're building if it's fantasy. So again, a fact that you can uncover will give you that springboard. You oscillate there, and how do I incorporate that, and how is it going to help with the further development here? So what I did with this novel the other day, Sonata at Midnight, the World War II novel, and I've been doing this a lot lately with this book particularly. I have obviously I'm on my computer, and if I need to know instantly what a German soldier corporal's stripe would be on his sleeve, I can look it up right there. In this particular case, I needed to find a book. I thought my main character, Billy, who's a pilot, has he's got this book with him when he's shot down over Norway. And I thought, well, what would be what was a bestseller in 1944? And this is an example of the serendipity that haunts me. I love it, but it's sometimes a bit spooky. In that I immediately Googled bestsellers of 1944, and the book that came up was called The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham. I don't know if any of you have read this book. It was sort of the on the road, Kerouac's on the road of its day, sort of 13 years before Kerouac. It was the story of a young man who basically he's got PTSD, though it wasn't called that then, from World War I, and he decides he can't return to his normal, comfortable, affluent, upper middle class life in Chicago. He's got to go in search of enlightenment. Now, the serendipity of it being that A, I've read the book twice and really like it. B, my grandfather, Cecil Humphreys, who was an actor, was in the movie with Tyrone Power. I just watched it recently. So Linda Shellshock, yes, that's quite correct. Linda was called Shellshock. So my grandfather did, and he played actually the guru that the young man Larry journeys to the high Himalaya to consult about enlightenment. And so that was a double dip for me. I thought it's a sign from God that I need to use this, the God of writing, that is. And but more importantly, what it did was he was not only reading just any book, he was reading a book that was about a young man who's pretty broken by his experience. And then he is seeking something different. He's had some terrible times in war. He's been quite traumatized. He's been shot down. He's killed people. And there's this book which speaks of a different sort of search, a different quest. So that immediately provided a springboard to my imagination. And I was able, I don't do a big analysis of the book or anything like that, but it's able, in a sort of synopsis that I've just given you, it's able to give my character things to go after. A second example, and this is by way of something slightly different. This was in a book of mine called A Place Called Armageddon. And it was about the fall of Constantinople in 1453, big siege, epic, multi-narrator book. And because it was multi-narrator, and I did it from both sides of the wall, Muslim characters, Christian characters, there were no good and bad guys really. It was all about people caught up in a huge event. I again spent obviously my initial time researching, and then the time as I was creating the book, more researching. But I realized I needed something, and this is where oscillation comes in. The oscillation between plot and character. I was writing that first draft and I thought all these characters, because I've been writing multi-narrator, some of them haven't appeared for 100 pages. I need to bring everyone back together for the actual opening of the siege. The first 150 pages were setup, character setup, why they're all there, why all these people have arrived at this point. And so I thought, well, how would I do that? And I started doing some research, and I thought, I wonder what birds are in Istanbul, Constantinople, all sing the song. Which birds are around there at this time of year, late spring? And, or actually mid-spring, early spring. And I Googled that, of course, and there this bird came up. It was called the laughing dove. And I put it up on YouTube, and there was this bird that basically went, ha, 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 ha. And I thought, that's good. And so I then made it appear in this chapter that closes part one of the book, basically. It appeared to all the different characters. So, and affected them in different ways. So the young woman, Sophia, has got her young daughter with her. She knows the siege is going on. She's trapped in the city. And she loves this bird because it really hails the return of spring to the city. But she knows that this is what's happening on the walls right now. And then it goes to her husband, who's not a soldier. He's a conniving diplomat, but he's had to put on armor. He's walking to the walls, and he's thinking, oh, I can't fight. What am I going to do? And then this dove starts laughing, and he thinks, oh yeah, you two mocking me as well. And then the dove flies over the wall, and there's I suppose the protagonist, looks up and sees the dove, and he's going, oh, Jesus, how did I end up back in Constantinople? But then it flies on, of course, over the Turkish lines. We have our Turkish characters. And in the end, slight spoiler alert, but in the end, the Sultan of the Turks, Mehmet, is out hawking. And of course, his hawk kills the dove. So what that did, that's just a good example of the springboard for the imagination. And it's a good example of the oscillation between a fact like that and character development. So I'm going to come on to sort of examples from world building now, because this is more fantasy world, and I know some of you are out there for fantasy. Though I do have to introduce a word of caution about research, and this is more a second draft caution, because I truly believe that anything you want to write in your first draft is fine, because no one's going to see it apart from you. It might be the stuff you need, because writing is writing, you need to get it out there. But you might find, at the second draft, which we're going to be dealing with in a subsequent workshop, you might find that that there's just too much stuff. It's, you then on the further drafts will weigh any of these facts. And yeah, I feel the same way about description, really. How is the description? Is it just a description, or is it serving to highlight your character's journey? Is it putting your character in context of the plot, his relationship with other people, or is it just a description? Which can be okay briefly, but the more I write, the less I like just pure description. I think it's got to serve that purpose of, or multiple purposes of also developing the character or giving us some idea about what this situation is bringing to him. Captain Coke in my novel Plague is walking along the Thames with a woman he's starting to fall in love with. And so do I want to describe the way the branches droop from a willow, or do I want to start to describe it and then he realizes it's just like the fall of her hair? So, but the caution I have is actually, it sounds like me name dropping, but it's a friend of mine is Diana Gabaldon, who I'm sure all of you have heard of. And she and I taught a workshop at the Surrey Writers Conference a while back, and she came up with this phrase, and it made me laugh so much. She said there's a school of writing which is basically summed up by the phrase, "I've suffered for my research, now it's your turn." So just beware of that. That might happen later. As I said, don't worry about it in the first draft. Put in as much description as you like. Put in as many facts as you like. But that's the stuff that's going to get pared down. Now, I'm going to come on to world building because that's something that, every story has world building in it. It's become associated with fantasy as a genre, particularly. But it's to set the context for the characters' journeys. So the details of place and times and society that the story takes place against, it's equally true for, a gritty expose of people smuggling in the Mediterranean, or the quest to regain the lost sword of Shalimar. I think Shalimar was actually a disco band in the 70s, wasn't it? But anyway, maybe they lost the sword. But world building is what a reader wants to feel immersed in a world and confident. So world building is where you place your characters against a world. Now, so it's a fine line context, where the balance can be struck. You can't skimp on all the details of the new world, or in fantasy, or times past in historical fiction, or alien shore in a documentary. You need to feel them in, or the reader will think, they haven't done their research, or they haven't really imagined what this world might be like. You have to place people in the context of the world by placing the characters within the context of that world. And again, as I say, a lot of this a lot of it will come out in the wash, as my old mum used to say. A lot of it will come out in the second draft. But certainly bear in mind that the fine line between too much and too little is often quite fine indeed. Now, the thing I want to talk about is something that I actually talked about right at the beginning. You know, how you use the springboard for the imagination. And I'm prone to quoting him, particularly this quote, but I was quoting Nietzsche, German philosopher, a little controversial, but an extraordinary man. And he wrote, "One must have chaos within who would give birth to a dancing star." And I believe that's a good phrase to capture that idea of almost before you're writing. You know you want to write, you've got some ideas that are going on. And I'll tell you a couple of stories. One is to do with how I wrote my fantasy book, The Hunt of the Unicorn. It was really, I'd been asked to write the book. I'd been asked to write a book. I'd written a trilogy, Runestone Saga, fantasy for Knopf in New York. And they liked them enough to say, my editor liked them enough to say, what are you going to write next? And I was like, oh, you know, I hadn't thought of writing fantasy. That was my first fantasy trilogy. I'd written three historical fiction books at that point. So I hadn't really thought of it. And I sat there literally in my office, I was living in Kitsilano at the time, going, well, you know, if he wants a book, it's powerful motivation, right? What am I going to do? What am I going to write about? What am I going to write about? Why do I have a unicorn on my finger? Because I have a unicorn. I don't know if you can see that. Oh, turn it that way. Yeah, it's probably can't. So anyway, unicorn. Lara in Vancouver, to everyone, could you please repeat that Nietzsche quote? Yes, I can. One must have chaos within who would give birth to a dancing star. So you're very welcome, Laura. Why do I wear a unicorn on my finger? And I immediately started Googling away. And I Googled, what does a unicorn mean? It's unconquerable. Huh? Unconquerable, except it can be tamed by a maiden. Now, oscillation, my brain's going, fantasy characters, maidens are good. You know, maybe the protagonist will be a young woman. So that's never a bad thing, considering it's young women who buy 80% of the books, right? So you know, your brain's working like this, of course, as a professional author. You have to think about that. You know, I wouldn't say most of my books are primarily written for the market necessarily, but I'd be a fool to ignore it. Unconquerable, but can be tamed by a maiden, can heal illnesses or take poison out of a polluted stream. I mean, where's a unicorn when you need one? And then the third thing that came up was the unicorn tapestries. These amazing tapestries that are in New York, in the Cloisters Museum, medieval tapestries. No one knows who made them. No one knows exactly where they were made, when they were made, who they were made for. They just know they were really expensive and some of the most stunning pieces of medieval art you've ever got an opportunity to see. I mean, take the opportunity if you can. They are extraordinary, and I did go. Because part of my motivation was, again, I like to travel with my research, and I always like to go to New York. So anyway, all these ideas were bouncing around. Now, to go back slightly to my way of climbing the mountain, for those who were with me from the beginning, they'll know I mixed my metaphors and came up with this idea of the alphabet technique. And the alphabet is that even though I don't outline a lot before, you know, history will dictate some of the structure. I know I'll want to get to that battle. Maybe if I start at A, that's where we first meet my main character. And I get to D because that's that battle. And then I get to H because that's when the young woman appears. Whatever, I'll know some of those things, but I don't know how I'm going to get between them. And this was what happened with Hunt of the Unicorn, because using those few facts that I come up with, I started sketching in the number of the letters of that alphabet. because the top of the alphabet, Z, is the top of the mountain, which you're trying to reach. So I thought of curing illnesses. What about giving my protagonist a major motivation in that her father is dying of leukemia? Now, you know, that's certainly powerful motivation, and no mother on the scene. The tapestries themselves, I thought, well, no one knows where they're from, who did them. But there are these wonderful, in each of the 6 tapestries, there are these letters woven in gold, all this woven art, it's extraordinary, but literally gold leaf. And these letters, A and E, entwined. So I thought, Alice Elaine, that's the name of my character. She's called Alice Elaine because she's the descendant of the person who wove the tapestries. That's it. And of course, the tapestries have a doorway from our world into another world because I'm writing fantasy and I want to introduce the unicorn, which, as we know, has departed our world and so has to exist somewhere else. So the unicorn, the doorway to where the unicorn is from our world, from the Cloisters Museum themselves, into the land of the fabulous beast, where all our myths live. And since her ancestor wove the tapestry, her father tells her the story of how that happened 500 years before, and how this door was left open, and how the unicorn would summon a daughter from the family to help in times of direst need. It was all there. It was all there from those little facts. And so she travels through the tapestries and ends up bonding, I suppose would be the word, with Moonspill, the unicorn. So those facts, she's at home with the father who's not well. C, he produces this book which tells the family story. H, she gets summoned through the tapestries to meet the unicorn. And between them, I joined it all up. I found my way between those points, which were given to me by the research I'd done. The other thing about that, I suppose, would be, and this is again for those of you who are writing fantasy, if you're writing fantasy that involves mythological beasts, that was obviously a big part of my research into what unicorns were. The sequel to Hunt of the Unicorn is The Hunt of the Dragon, and so I then, because of course you've had unicorns, you've got to have dragons, and so I then researched dragons as well, and that was great fun and gave me, again, all those springboards. Now, just to jump back into, because that's a different type of fantasy. It's a Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe type of fantasy, our world into another world. With high fantasy, or what they call high epic fantasy, which the authors whose middle initials are RR seem to specialize in, is pure epic fantasy world. And my recent trilogy, Immortals Blood Trilogy, the first book is Smoke and the Glass, the second book is The Coming of the Dark, and the third book is The Wars of Gods and Men. That's the one I'm doing the final edit on right now. So there I had to create this whole world that wasn't related to our world at all, or related to our myths, as Goloth is in The Hunt of the Unicorn, or the Hunt trilogy, in fact it is, because I wrote a third one. You think of things like Tolkien's Middle-earth, you think of George R.R. Martin's Westeros, you think of Ursula Le Guin and her world Winter, which is in The Left Hand of Darkness, which I actually thought was probably the best of all those three, but anyway, I love that. They've had to create credible other worlds that are different from us, but also similar in some ways. Sometimes they push, like Ursula Le Guin does, push the weather idea to an extreme. In Immortals Blood, I opted for 2 moons, which I created 4 different worlds actually, but 3 that we focused on initially. And one was called Corinthium, and it was sort of Byzantium, Greco-Roman style. One was called Midgarth, which was particularly Norse, and one was a Mesoamerican world called Ometepe. And so I was again, when I talked about the agents saying, oh, you don't have to do any research. I mean, you do tons of research. You do tons of research on that sort of world. How can I render a world that's credibly Norse, but I will then bend it into a fantasy element? And the fantasy elements in Immortals Blood trilogy are really that not only do these three worlds exist in isolation from each other, they don't know the other exists. It's quite a big planet. They think they're the sole occupants. But in each of those worlds, there's a certain number of people who are immortal. They've lived for several hundred years. If they die, they immediately are reborn. That's how they usually find out if they're immortal or not. So there's immortality. They're kind of like the 1%. There's a sort of veiled political commentary in my novels. But also, not only that, but in two of those worlds, the Greco-Roman world and the Norse world, the immortals have an additional ability to possess another entity. In the Norse world, kind of like Norse myth, they can possess animals for a time, just go into it, they dissolve, they're gone, they're in an animal for a while. Allowing the animal to do what it does, but also controlling it to a certain extent. Same ditto the Corinthians, as I call them, but they can possess humans, another human, live their life for a while. I won't go into the whole plot. It transpires that this gift or curse of the blood, as some people have discovered it to be, came from an external source. So the societies I used gave me a sort of baseline of research, of facts, of more of those springboards for the imagination. Now, the perils of world building are a little like the perils of research. People can get very carried away with the worlds they built. And again, first draft, I would encourage you to build away. In the end, the second draft, which we're going to spend a lot of time on probably next week, I think, is where you're going to pare that away. But to start with, write it up. I mean, some people do elaborate backstories, and I mean, none of that's going to go to waste, really. But for me, again, and I'm going to keep banging on about this, it comes down to character. So if you create an elaborate world, that's great. But what is that going to present to your character in terms of the obstacles he, she, or they, or it needs to overcome, and the action that results from that? Remember my acronym Komoka: characters, objectives, meetings, obstacles creates action. When Elaine, as she prefers to call herself, because Elaine seems so weird in 2015 Manhattan, when she encounters a unicorn, of course, she has to, it's unbelievable. She's obviously hallucinating, or she's fallen into a coma, or something weird's happening. But when a manticore tries to eat her, her obstacle is, I don't want to be eaten by the manticore. So that in itself, the research, a manticore, that's an interesting creature, creates the action. Man-eaters, manticores. So just remember that, as long as you remember the context of the characters is the king of it, you won't go far wrong. Always ask yourself, is what I've just described mere decoration, or is it does the thing that's happening here in that tavern, in that forest, having been picked up by a giant eagle, what is the impact on your character? So I'm going to leave some time for questions, because I know we're already pushing up against it. But I want to say a little bit more about that first ascent. if you've set out not knowing too much, if you've got your characters, if you're learning about your characters as they react to circumstance, if they're going into this world, historical, fantasy, modern crime, I'm largely talking fiction here, but most documentaries these days seem to have a dramatic element. It's still taking the elements of story and placing one element against another element. Some you focus on a character. I haven't watched a lot of it, but Tiger World, what's that thing called? It's something like that anyway. John will tell us. But it's still about characters. That's what we're going to follow. So if you use that first ascent, you're oscillating between the research you've done and how it affects your character. You're oscillating between the plot you've already started to work out. I'm not saying that it's a complete blank slate. You will know the type of story you want to tell. You've been, in order to land a contract, often you have to write a treatment, which unfortunately have got longer and longer over the years. I used to be able to basically write it on a napkin and an editor would say, have some money. They don't do that anymore. Now it's like 40 pages, 50 pages of stuff. Which is great because I completely ignore it afterwards. It's just a way, it's a different stage of the process, land the contract with a good pitch. And that's something, again, another subject I will talk more about later on, probably towards the end of these master classes. Now, I just finished the first draft of this World War II novel, as I said. Hurrah! It's called Sonata at Midnight. And I'm so looking forward to diving into the second draft because I have to say this, because I've written 22 novels, and I hesitate to say because I always think, is it 21, 22? Anyway, Sonata will be the 22nd novel. My first drafts have got cleaner and cleaner and cleaner as I go. So I tend, whereas my early novels, probably the first 5 novels I overwrote and pared back. My subsequent novels, generally, I've slightly underwritten and added to. I suspect this is not going to be the case with this one because it's taken so long to write. I wrote the first 70 pages in 2014, and then I've read them since and tweaked them a bit since. But I suspect this is going to pare down a little, probably not very much. But I still used the techniques I've been talking about here, not knowing too much is what I start with, finding those characters, letting them tell me the story, powering up the mountain, getting to the top and going, whew. Okay, let me have some questions here. I can see a few has popped up in the chat. For description, could you talk about the level of detail you recommend? How do we find the balance between helping the reader feel they are there, but also use their imagination? That's a couple of points, actually, and they're all interesting. Well, I think the level of detail, again, if you can, I would judge it by how far are you straying from what a detail is for. If it's setting the context of the character in the world, you could add a lot. If we need to know that the streets they're walking down are full of garbage, or I wrote this book Plague about England in the Great Plague, or London specifically in the Great Plague of London in 1665. There were a lot of details there that needed to be got out, so we knew what the character was experiencing. The fact that London smelt way better than it ever had done because they collected the rubbish. They couldn't allow it to gather in the street because they thought that had something to do with it. They thought the plague was spread by sort of stuff in the air, like a smell, like a miasma. So they weren't driving sheep through the streets anymore, or cattle, or anything. So there was less shit around. They weren't. They gave an order to kill all the dogs and cats. And they tried to kill the rats, but of course the rats are much harder to kill than dogs and cats, and so the rats multiplied. They made not nooses for their own necks, but, buboes for their own armpits, I suppose. But anyway, so those are the sort of details but again, if Karen, you're looking at it and thinking, you're putting the reader definitely in the place. You also say, though, helping the reader feel they are there, but also use their imagination. It's a vast topic, this, actually, but it's also quite important. Over detail will almost take away the opportunity for a reader to imagine. I tend not to describe my characters that in great detail. Maybe a bit of hair, maybe a bit of height, but I don't go into 2 pages of this is what this person looked like, because I like the idea of the reader filling some of that stuff in. Same with the descriptions of cities, things like that. Yes, give them the context, but like the character, allow them to experience it in their own way, because I think this is a truth universally acknowledged that it takes 2 people to make a book. This is leaving aside all the publishers and editors and copy editors and publicists and booksellers, all of whom are vital. But the 2 people it really requires to make a book are the writer and the reader. And it's between them that the book happens. So allowing your reader some space to, and it sounds like a recipe for laziness, and I'm not advocating that at all. But judicious description, judicious context setting, that's the key. Lydia asks me, since you wrote the book over a long period of time, has your writing style changed? If yes, how will you ensure consistency in style? No, not really. I mean, I say not really. I know I don't think my writing style has changed a whole hell of a lot since I wrote The French Execution, my first novel 20 years ago. I've got better at it. I've got better at seeing what isn't relevant to the story and to the characters. I've got better at distinguishing that. I think my first few books were what I would call a series of exciting incidents linked together, and so they're great fun to read. But the through structure of them is not as clear. So it's not so much to do with style. I'm better at structuring now and plotting a novel. So that would be the key there. Who else is any? Oh, Mary says, could you give us that again? What is Komoka? C-O-M-O-C-A. Characters could be, the apostrophe could be in either place. Characters, objectives, meeting obstacles creates action. And if people weren't there last week when I delved into that a bit more, I just like to say that Komoka is the way if I'm stuck in any way, Komoka gets me unstuck. I've said before, and I will say it again, I don't believe in writer's block. There's always something you can be doing, writing, even if it's like, off-piste, as they say in skiing. Something else. There's something you can do with your character. And a character, giving them an objective, maybe take them off-piste, start writing by hand instead of a computer, write some stuff about, take a character into a situation they would never be in. Maybe they're, I don't know, they're a nanny, but they suddenly get into a fight in a bar. I mean, that is something, but just take them off-piste and play with that. Play with that, that obstacle, and write the action that ensues. It will tell you more about your character. Right. Anything else here? Let me see. Any tips on say that again. Any tips on maintaining tension while using description? Yeah. It has to do with character. You knew I'd say that, right? If your character is running down the street chasing someone, and then the chase becomes the importance, and the obstacles are the descriptions of what they have to, literally obstacles perhaps, the cart that is there. I wrote a novel called Shakespeare's Rebel, which I turned into a play. Actually, it was on at Bar on the Beach in 2015. Anyway, it's about William Shakespeare's fight choreographer. There's a fight in the street, and I just, they do this very well on television, but we do it as novelists as well, I think, right? Keep adding levels of obstacles to your character's dilemma. So not only was my character slightly drunk, or actually, no, he was really hungover. Not only was he's under an edict, he's a fighter, he mustn't kill anyone. He mustn't name anyone. It's just like, he mustn't do it. He does not want to fight. Great fighters usually don't. But he's forced into it because otherwise his friend, a writer called William Shakespeare, is about to be killed. So he has to jump in and fight. But there's an eel salesman there, and someone crashes into the eel, and suddenly all the eels are on the ground, and he's about to launch an attack, and he stands on an eel. That's the sort of thing. So you're getting a description of an Elizabethan street scene, but through the character's needs and obstacles. So that's I would say. It doesn't have to be a chase, it doesn't have to be a fight, but there's something that the character wants that the description is aiding or hindering. That's what I would say. Right, anything else? Sometimes the details and description can add humor. Any examples? Well, I would say the Eels was a humorous addition to that scene that I did not know was going to happen, but from my research of Shakespearean London, I knew what stalls were there. So Eels was a likely thing. Do you know the expression humble pie? When one eats one eats humble pie, but it was actually umbles. Umbles were sheep guts, and that's what went into the pies on the streets of London. So that could add a little extra thing, humble and umble. Playing with those sort of linked words. Okay, one last question. The Unicorn was written for YA readers. Did you change how you did descriptions in that versus adults? Not really. I mean, no, not really. The same rules apply. I don't. I mean, it's a question I get often asked because I've written for young adults as well. And how does your style change? To be honest, it doesn't really. It's more about choice of protagonist, because I think teenagers more want to read about teens. It's about the type of journey they're going to take. Because I don't usually, I don't drag things out in either of my those genres, right? Numerous genres, but YA or adult, it's what's called cutting to the chase, really. I like to keep the story going. And it doesn't mean you can't have pause, because you need pause to take a breath. So listen, it's time to call a halt to this. I hope that was useful. I can't remember what we're doing next week, but I suspect it's to do with the second draft and how one creates a passage up the mountain for someone to follow. It'll be about why I outline at that point, the first time I've properly outlined a book, and we'll keep banging on about character and how the character changes, and how what they've told you about themselves will influence how the mountain is climbed the second time. Right, that is it. I hope to see you all next week. I hope you enjoyed it, and please come back. Bye-bye.